So 2020, the UK was basically on fire. COVID was widespread, cases were rising, we were on the verge of a second lockdown, the NHS, the economy and businesses were struggling. As a result, in September 2020, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, announced an ambitious plan dubbed Moonshot to test everyone in the UK and to help reopen society. Underpinning this was standing up a mass testing service to screen the entire population of 66 million. And our team was tasked with designing the service, the asymptomatic testing service, where people can use lateral flow devices, so rapid antigen tests, to detect whether they are infectious, regardless of whether or not they're showing symptoms. We started with site prototypes in essential workplaces before rolling out and scaling the service, both as a site-based and home test service across the entire nation. Kia ora koutou, and thank you. We're excited to have an opportunity to connect with home and share some of our insights and stories. Our talk today will be less focused on solution design, but more on what we're doing on the ground and the impact that it had on all of us. Upon reflection, all three of us realised that we're still feeling the effects of burnout, and it highlighted that well-being, the good and the bad, was a core part of our experience. Hi everyone, I'm Carol.
I'm Georgia.
Kia ora koutou, I'm Cobby, and we were all service design leads within the same team as part of the UK's mass testing program to deliver end-to-end service for rapid testing. I want to just start off with a bit of a story about one of my sites, which became quite impactful for me. It was one of the UK's largest steel manufacturers. They had a period of critical maintenance, so 3 weeks of maintenance, which they didn't complete. It would have an impact for them in the order of millions of dollars per day in terms of lost production and penalties. The site itself had 4,000 staff on it. We were testing 800 people before they stepped foot on site each morning. And that site was 10 kilometres long, and it didn't have any internal places to have suitable testing. So we had to adapt the test site that we designed, still meeting all the clinical requirements that we had to meet, but allow for that really, really high throughput. This site in particular was so intense, partly because in the first week we had 4 individuals who tested positive, all of whom were asymptomatic and all of whom ended up becoming really, really unwell. One in particular actually was hospitalised. And the thing that made it really, really raw is that we actually lost one of the testing staff members due to COVID. And it was just a continuous reminder around why we were doing it, the importance of testing. And it actually had a really big impact on my mental health as well.
So this talk is the result of us reflecting on our mental health, and we've structured it into 6 key takeaways from our involvement in the mass testing program. The first of which is realising that while we got a lot out of this, it wasn't for everyone. G?
So the first couple of key takeaways we're going to take you guys through today are more focused on the kind of early stages of forming your team, building your team, and setting off on a program of this nature. So it was important for us in retrospect to acknowledge that this type of work, so designing an emergency response or designing a crisis, is not for everyone, and particularly it can be a real risk to somebody's well-being to push a square peg into a round hole. And when we were thinking about, well, who is this work not for, it was really helpful for us to narrow down to a select few characteristics of who actually does suit this kind of work. Chief amongst those characteristics, somebody that really enjoys a very messy problem-solving process. So not precious about needing to start again and needing to start again multiple times. So this was truly iterative in our experience. For instance, the actual testing technology we were using, so what the tests looked like and how they worked, it changed about 4 times on us in the first month of designing how we would build the service and roll it out to 66 million people. So a lot of starting again. Secondly, highly pragmatic and practical designers, as opposed to very academic or theoretical designers. In a program of this nature, you don't need a team of artists. You need a team of people that have a little bit of the creativity of an artist, but a whole load of whether it's mechanical, engineering, commercial, or just logical acumen, because we needed a lot of resourcefulness for folks on the ground that were designing. And with that, I think comes an understanding of what's good enough. So acknowledge that it's going to be a bit rubbish, but we just need to get there as quickly as we possibly can. Then we will iterate and improve over time. And finally, another really key characteristic in a program of this nature where it's very fast-paced and it's usually highly multidisciplinary, good arbitrators and good diplomats. For our team in particular, we had a huge amount of negotiation and face time with clinical teams and the digital team that was actually building what we designed. It wouldn't have been helpful if we had designers that really struggled to get off their high horse and make amendments to their design. A couple of just practical takeaways for folks that are in leadership or project management roles as well that I think were really helpful to us to reflect on. Firstly, be kind to yourself in the beginning. You're not going to pick the right people for your team immediately. So in the early stages of your project, leave yourself some buffer to move the chess pieces around. Don't commit to your team makeup straight away. You probably will need to roll a couple of people on, a couple of people off. That's just the nature of the game. And then finally, we found as well, and I think this is something we did quite well on the program, recognize when your team skill set needs to change and do something about it. So a good example for us is that we had a team of really strong service designers that specialized in the early stages of Imagine and early stages of design to create a functioning prototype. These are not people that are going to be great at delivery roles, sort of BAU run roles. So it made more sense for us to roll that team of designers off, redeploy them where they were needed more, and instead keep people on that team that were more they were better at delivery roles basically, and they were more in the right place to run through a scale run. I don't think I have anything else to add to you guys.
No. So, this stuff is hard, right? It's unprecedented. No country in the world has designed a service to rapidly test on a regular basis their entire population. So there are going to be absolute highs and there are going to be absolute lows, which means actually at times you are going to feel shit. Your team is going to feel shit, and that's okay. What this kind of means is at a team level, like cracks and positivity isn't a weakness or a failure in your team. It's actually healthy to allow for negative thoughts and feelings. Speaking of massive highs and massive lows, personally, I remember the absolute exhilaration we got from getting something live. It was really damn awesome, particularly some of the first sites. But I also distinctly remember bawling my eyes out after spending all of what is Chinese New Year literally on calls on my laptop and then having pasta for dinner rather than spending it at home in beautiful sunny New Zealand with my family. Also, another thing we learnt was that it was really difficult to seek support from those who weren't necessarily in it with you. And the reality was most of that was due to the fact that what we were doing was quite sensitive. A lot of what we were doing was we were designing for the relative immediate crisis emergency future, and it hadn't been publicly announced yet. And as a result, there wasn't a lot you could share with your loved ones, your friends, your family. But we mitigated this by seeking support from your comrades or UK's favourite ritual, the pub, either in real life, in the small window between lockdowns, or over Deliveroo or Uber Eats in the office or on a coffee run. Comrade therapy for us was actually a huge help in relieving that tension and anxiety that you felt being on an engagement like this. Also, it's really difficult to step away from something like this when it's also your personal life that's being affected by the pandemic. So it's pandemic at work, pandemic in personal life. And the reality is that we were working really, really long days, nights and weekends. And there wasn't a lot to get excited about outside of work that London would normally offer you. The great weekends away in Europe, the restaurants, the bars, the shows, everything was closed. Gee, how did you find it?
On this topic, a couple of things come to mind in instances where I witness leaders really, I suppose, trying to blanket their teams in forced positivity and seeing any complaining as a show of weakness in their team. And I think if that happens, you're really curtailing quite a healthy, natural first-line outlet for people. If it's something that's really hard, it should be okay to complain about it. And by that I mean don't turn your team into one big whinge fest. But it's an important first step in finding your way to healthy strategies and healthy support networks. So you should be able to vocalise your negative feelings in a workplace. Matt?
Yeah, it was a few weeks ago following the UK restrictions easing. We went out for a few drinks with the wider project team, where everyone was really, really open about how they felt. And it was so incredibly cathartic to share how you felt. And it was amazing. Like, we're obviously aware of everyone struggling, but it was amazing just some of the lows and the depths of what people were at. And so being able to share how you felt, talk about it with people who had the same shared experience was so important, and just reiterated how important it is to share. So, G, do you want to tell us about how we can do that more?
Yes, something that we've all been trying to apply since our experience on mass testing is early doors on a project. Share your signals, and by signals we mean the signs or behaviour changes you might exhibit when you're experiencing overwhelm, stress or burnout. So I'm sure a lot of people listening today probably frequently do this with their project teams anyway. You do a ways of working session at the beginning of a project. What do you like? What do you not like? Are you a morning person, an evening person, and so on? And I've started encouraging my teams to, in those sessions, also add on, these are my signals of when I'm reaching my limit, or these are my signals of when I'm experiencing real stress. And that way, it's not all on you as an individual to be looking out for your own signals. You've got others on the lookout for them. And it also encourages people to exercise some self-awareness at the beginning of a complex or trying project. Something else that I think we found really useful on the mass testing project is being very, very clear early doors about skill set and role. And a good example of that, and Cobby, I'm going to steal from your experience, but Cobby was brought in to help roll out some testing in a pharmacy setting, and I think he did a really good job of explaining very early on, my role is to simply get a functioning prototype. Once that's done, my role is complete. I am stepping away. My skill set, my role has nothing to do with scaling and delivery in this setting. And I think setting those very clear boundaries up front was really helpful.
Yeah, that was really important for me, and it helped with basically the situation that I was in. I am someone that has had burnout, like quite serious burnout in a different instance. And I would say I'm relatively well versed at recognising the signals and markers in myself, but even having been through it before and being quite aware of it, I still got burnout, and it just kind of highlights that no one is immune to it. And so having deadlines and means to be able to create balance and separation is really, really important. So how could we maybe do that some more, Carol?
So while it's really important to put various mechanisms in place to try and introduce some separation, balance and distance wherever possible, the challenge is that was actually really, really, really hard to do in practice, given that what we were doing was all consuming. So it became apparent quite early that we had to put stop points or deadlines or what we described as a personal definition of done in place as mechanisms to help manage the risk of burnout for ourselves, but also our teams. Everyone's definition of done is different. So for some on our team, they needed a firm time frame that they were working to, a light at the end of the tunnel that they knew they could sprint to, get what they needed done, and then roll off. For me, it was about getting the service live and stable, and then that was my kind of done. As a team lead, however, it's important to recognise that what your team needs may actually be different to what you need, and you need to be receptive to this. But at the same time, this is also really hard because you're also under a lot of pressure yourself. So part of your role as a team lead is about thinking about how do you allow for your team to have the conditions to enable themselves to be successful, not only on this kind of crisis engagement, but also beyond as well. So a couple of examples that we had in our team environment. For one of our team, we actually allowed him to step out when he needed to. So he literally just had a signal to myself and another team lead where he effectively waved a flag on Slack, and we knew that we just needed to give him some space. He would make sure everything was temporarily handed over, and he just needed to go for a bike ride or go for a coffee and get some air and spend some time on his own, and then he was all good to go. For others, we actually set in quite structured and quite firm exit dates for people so that they had sight of their personal finish line and could work towards that. Although in saying that, as part of any exit, we needed to put in place mechanisms for a smooth transition. And this was absolutely critical, given that what we were working on was of national importance.
We've spoken a lot about things that work at a team level, but I think what we'll do now is shift gear a little bit and start talking about at an individual level some strategies that have worked for us. And I'll hand over to Matt to take us through this next one.
Yeah, I think it can be really difficult to actually talk about this. It's an incredibly confronting topic, and often people find it really difficult. If you're struggling with burnout, it's very difficult to articulate how you really feel. Sometimes you can have a response where when you raise how you feel, people react that you're broken, when in reality you just want to share how you're feeling, have a chat in a slightly more intimate level. And then someone who's supporting them, it can also be difficult to actually understand what they're really meaning, to put bias aside, whether that's a plan that you have in place that this person having burnout might affect, whether it's prior experiences also having bias on how you might interpret how they're feeling. Picking what they're saying apart, digging deeper, going between the layers, and ultimately coaching them to identify an outcome is so important for having a good, honest conversation. And I think it can be really difficult to build relationships with people, to have that trust that they can open up to you. I can't stress it enough. It's just so important to have a good, honest, human conversation.
And on the note of having good, honest human conversations, I wonder if we can shift gears and talk a little bit about what we lovingly refer to as the Suffering Olympics, a COVID phenomenon. And I'm going to hand over to Carol to dig into this.
So the Suffering Olympics, it's all relative, right? Like what your personal threshold is doesn't have anything, for me, didn't have anything to do with what George's was, what Matt's was, what anyone else in the teams was. But one thing we all experienced multiple times at some point, various points in the project, was actually the Suffering Olympics, whereby people needed to be the next Michael Phelps, Lisa Carrington, or Hamish Bond, winning that suffering gold medal. However, combating somebody's concern with one-upmanship, we found wasn't helpful, and it actually wasn't relevant unless you were helping that person understand or feel more comfortable or be able to articulate what it is that they were feeling. Upon reflection, though, one of the things we could have been a lot better at was understanding how the team was feeling on a much more regular and shorter cadence. While we did do this, we didn't do it as often as we should have. And a technique that we found worked really well is doing something very quick, either in a stand-up or a wash-up, and we had stand-ups every morning, wash-ups every evening, was just doing a quick self-rating, either a kind of thumbs, fingers, things. So, whether it's a kind of thumbs up, level down, or, number of fingers to indicate how you were feeling, to give a really quick indication to the team, what's morale, what do we need to be doing to change things, or are people going really well and actually we should ride this particular high. The importance of the role of the team lead is quite an interesting one in this context, because actually your role is about being receptive to the feedback and being receptive to think about what you can do to change that. So putting in some form of anonymous, regular feedback mechanism to enable you to understand the general feel and vibe of your team and make changes where you can is really important, particularly so that you can give individuals the right support that you need.
I think that's the last of our key takeaways for today. So to wrap up, I think there are a couple of important things to state. One is that people don't always know when they're burnt out. Everyone is different, and burnout will look and feel different for everyone. And for that reason, our learning, I think, has been to put in place multiple strategies to manage stress, to manage burnout, not just one, not just two. And that's to account for the fact that folks will experience things very differently and different strategies will work for them and some of them won't. As a manager, I think the best you can do is to be cognizant of signals and changes in your team. If you do notice any changes, it might be a sign, and so it's just best to be proactive about reaching out and having slightly uncomfortable conversations. And then secondly, this was very hard. And I know we've said that a lot in this talk, but we were designing something incredibly complex in a very short period of time that was of huge national significance, and the scale of it was massive too. 66 million people getting tested is a big number. So of course that's going to take a human toll. And for that reason, I think you would have noticed that a lot of what we spoke about today was not about removing or completely curtailing any kind of stress or burnout amongst your team. Because if you're working in crisis, people are just going to feel that way. We're all human. So I hope that you've taken away some practical mechanisms from what we've shared about not eradicating it, but managing it when it does crop up. As Carol mentioned at the top of the talk, in February we'll come back and instead we'll talk in a lot more detail about the actual design process and how we went about prototyping and scaling testing sites that we've mentioned. But thank you guys for listening.